I was planning to get married in October of 1954. By that time, Hal Benson, who was his name was Albert Benzabad III from New Orleans. He was the son of Corinne Dunbar of the restaurant fame, and his stepfather was Mr. Brown of Brown's Velvet, but he shunned the society angle of it. Went to WDSU radio, then moved to Memphis, became one of the top disc jockeys over there. So we got to be good friends, and he said, "Where you going on your honeymoon?" I said, "Well, I hope to go to where all Cajuns go, New Orleans, the coast, the Lux, if we get past New Orleans." He said, "Why don't you go to Memphis?" I said, "Well, what's with Memphis?" Well, he said, "You got a new car," which I had a new Plymouth, and he said, "I have a Jew bill." Well, I hadn't been in radio long enough to know what a Jew bill was, but it turns out it's a trade odd between vendors and radio stations. Whereas if you give enough plugs for a motel, they'll let you, have so many rooms. So he said, "I have a $150 Jew bill here that they owe me." He said, "Why don't you go there? You'll have the whole week free." Well, that sounded enticing to me. So my future wife said, "Okay, we'll go." So the afternoon after my old-fashioned wedding, I had one of the last weddings where you iced beer and everything in the pirogue. And we headed off for Memphis from the two-lane highways at the time. And Hal had told me before I left, he gave me a letter of introduction to the guy at the motel who owned the motel there. And he gave me a letter of introduction to Bob Neal, who was the top disc jockey at WMPS at the time. So we checked in the motel, and Hal told me, he said, "Look, you'll see Mr. Keemon Wilson there. He'll probably be at the desk." He said, "He's a good friend of mine." He said, "Sort of nutty. He hopes to start a chain of his motels." He said, "They only got 2 right now. They're in Memphis." So consequently, my wife and I stayed in the first Holiday Inn that was ever built. And they only had 2 then in October of 1954. So anyway, Mr. Keemon Wilson, we did meet him. He later turned out to be president of probably the largest motel chain in the world. That next day, we went to WMPS and met Bob Neal. And, the big thing going on that day at WMPS was the fact that Boss Crump, who had been a political leader of Memphis, like the Longs of Louisiana for 30 years, was scheduled to die that day. So the station were rushing around doing his obituary and stuff like that, and consequently, I don't think he died for another 2 months yet. So Bob Neal said, "Leroy," said, "I want Hal to know that, I gave you a good time over here. He said, I'd like you to come to the Eagle's Nest tonight." He said, "A good country and western band is playing." And he said, CPI John, and he said, "And my protege, I'm managing a new guy, is going to be there on the intermission. I'd like you to listen to him." So we went to the Eagle's Nest, my wife and I. Bob Neal sat with us at the table, and sure enough, intermission comes along, and here comes a young fellow with a 2-piece band, 3 pieces altogether. And I guess you've guessed it by now, that was Elvis Presley. And so after his intermission bid, Bob Neal called him to the table, and he introduced us, and hello. He shook my wife's hand, shook my hand, sat down. Very few words. Bob Neal did most of the talking. And so anyway, years later, when this became common knowledge that my wife and I were entertained on our second night in Memphis, to a crowd of maybe 40 people in the whole club, they asked me how I liked him. I said, "Well, I'll be frank with you." I said, he was 19, my wife was 19. They were both beautiful people as far as I'm concerned. And I was the old man of 24. And I said, to be frank, I didn't pay too much attention to him. Well, about a month later, I got a letter from Bob Neal saying that we'd like to present. Elvis was still unknown outside of Memphis at this time. And still, when I got the letter, he said, "I'd like to introduce him in the New Orleans area." Well, it seemed I had probably built myself up a little too much, that I was a booking agent and stuff like that. Fact was, I was only a government employee, and I used to play music on the side. But he wanted me to book him, and he said, I wrote him back. In fact, I called him back. We were talking on the phone. I said, "Look, Bob," I said, I've played his record. I brought back his record. I said, "It didn't get much attention on my radio program." I said, "And what do you expect me to pay for him?" Well, he said, $150 a night. That'll take care of the 3 of them. He said, "And of course, I'd like room and board." He said, "And transportation." Well, I added it all up. That would cost me about $400 or $500. And I told him, I said, "Well, Bob, I don't think I can break the nut on this thing here." And so consequently, I passed it up. And since then, I've been known as the idiot who who turned down a Elvis Presley appearance in South Louisiana.